First, we'd like you to consider your general orientation towards assessment. The traditional view of assessment is assessment of learning, where the purpose of assessment is generally to determine students' grades. However, this orientation neglects an equally and possibly more important purpose, that is, assessment that actually contributes to students' learning. Let's take a look at this in a bit more detail. If our orientation towards assessment is simply the assessment of student learning, the main purpose of assessment is to assign students grades, and generally focuses on students' abilities to replicate information from lectures, textbooks, and readings, or other classroom activities. A major issue with this orientation towards assessment is that it tends to focus our assessment efforts on high-stakes assessments. However, these high-stakes assessments have several important issues to consider. First is that many students suffer from test anxiety, meaning that their performance may be diminished, not based on their knowledge, abilities, or skills, but simply because they are anxious because of the effect their performance on the assessment will have on their grades. Another problem with relying on formal high-stakes assessment is that these types of assessments systematically underestimate the knowledge of underrepresented student groups. A phenomenon called DIF, or differential item functioning, demonstrates that items on high-stakes tests are more difficult for minority students than they are for majority students with similar knowledge and abilities. Educational researchers still struggle to fully understand and correct for DIF. Finally, high-stakes assessments tend to encourage a get-it-then-forget-it mentality, meaning these types of assessments may encourage students to study and learn information in a manner that maximizes their performance on the exam without optimizing learning. Over-reliance on formal high-stakes assessments minimizes students' opportunities to practice using their knowledge and skills. Students learn better when they have opportunities to fail than learn from their mistakes. When thinking about our orientation towards assessment, I think we need to consider whether our main purpose for assessment is as an incentive for students to do assigned readings, study, participate in class, etc. And if this is the case, does this mean assessment is the stick or the punishment for not completing assigned readings or studying? This comic is a likely all too familiar consequence of an assessment of learning orientation. Students want to focus all of their time simply on material that they will be tested on, instead of taking a more holistic view of what they are actually learning from your course. Next, we'll consider an alternative orientation towards assessment. When our orientation towards assessment is assessment for learning, the purpose of assessment is to provide learning opportunities for our students, giving students an opportunity to practice using the knowledge you are teaching them to hone important skills and abilities they will need in the future. In fact, we might expect students, as novices, will fail at their first attempts to apply the knowledge and skills they've learned. Assessment for learning may have a very different flow than a more traditional assessment of learning orientation. It also forces us to think about assessment as a process rather than as a task for students to prove themselves.